All right, I want to bring in CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa for more on this.
Great to be with you, Vlad. Based on my reporting, it's evident that the people around President Trump now are the types of people who really understand his personality. They know that he wants to be in the center of all executive action and legislative action. They're not trying to nudge him in any direction. They know he's going to take a lot of inputs at time. He will make a round of phone calls to friends, allies, different associates. That's the kind of leader he is. That's how he ran his businesses at Trump Tower. When I would go up and visit him at Trump Tower, it was always Trump at the center, Trump with many spokes coming into the wheel in terms of the management style.
Okay, I need to talk to you about something that happened on Trump's very first day back in office that is still sending shockwaves through the American political system many months later. And honestly, this might be one of the most significant and controversial things Trump has done in his entire second term. And that's really saying something given everything else we've been covering on this channel. On January 20th, 2025, the exact same day he was inaugurated and sworn in as president for the second time, Trump declared a national energy emergency. He invoked emergency powers under federal law to essentially give himself sweeping authority to override state policies on energy, to bypass Congress entirely on major spending decisions, to redirect billions upon billions of dollars, and to fundamentally reshape American energy policy through executive action alone, without any democratic input or legislative process. And the reaction from across the political spectrum has been absolutely explosive ever since. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Democrats are calling it a dictator-style power grab that threatens the very foundations of constitutional government. Environmental groups are filing lawsuits left and right, challenging every aspect of what Trump did. Even some Republicans, particularly those who remember warning about executive overreach during the Obama years, are quietly expressing serious concern about the constitutional implications of what Trump claimed the authority to do with a single signature. This isn't just about energy policy. Although the energy implications are certainly enormous and will affect every American, this is about how much power a president can legitimately claim through emergency declarations, and whether there are any real meaningful limits on executive authority when someone is willing to push the boundaries as aggressively and as far as Trump is clearly willing to push them. Let me explain exactly what Trump did on that first day, because the scope of this executive order is genuinely stunning when you really take the time to understand what it actually contains and authorizes. On his first day back in office, before he had even finished the inaugural celebrations,
President Trump is basically saying mission accomplished and signaling that his takeover of law enforcement in D.C. will soon spread to other cities. An executive order signed today directs the Pentagon to create specialized guard units in every state to deal with, quote, public order issues.
We want to go from here to other places. I made the statement that next should be Chicago because, as you all know, Chicago is a killing field right now. And they don't acknowledge it. This is one of the safest cities right now in the world, as crazy as that sounds. And it took 7 days. It took really 3 days, but we're now in our 11th day.
Trump signed Executive Order 14156, invoking the National Emergencies Act. This is a law that gives the president significant expanded powers during genuine emergencies, things like natural disasters that require immediate federal response or attacks on the country that demand rapid military action. But Trump didn't invoke it because of a hurricane devastating American communities or a terrorist attack threatening American lives. He invoked it because he claimed there was insufficient energy production in certain parts of the country, specifically pointing to the Northeast and the West Coast as regions supposedly suffering from energy shortages. He argued that this supposed energy shortage constitutes a direct threat to national security and to the American economy. And based solely on that claim, he ordered federal agencies to take sweeping actions that would normally require explicit congressional approval or years of careful regulatory process with public input. The executive order directs the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency to immediately suspend green mandates, environmental regulations that have been developed over many decades through proper legal processes with extensive scientific review and public comment periods. It redirects more than $10 billion in federal funds toward fossil fuel infrastructure projects, money that was specifically appropriated by Congress for entirely different purposes through the normal budget process. It orders the deployment of military logistics capabilities to support pipeline construction and energy transportation projects across the country. It fast-tracks drilling permits and export approvals that would normally take months or even years to process through proper regulatory channels. All of this, every single bit of it, bypassing Congress entirely. No votes from elected representatives, no hearings where experts could testify, no debate where different perspectives could be considered. Just Trump signing a piece of paper and claiming that emergency powers allow him to do essentially whatever he wants on energy policy, regardless of existing law. And here's what makes this particularly alarming from a constitutional perspective. This isn't the only emergency Trump has declared since returning to office. He also declared a national emergency at the southern border on the exact same day, claiming there's an invasion happening that justifies extraordinary measures, including potentially using military force domestically against migrants. Between the border emergency and the energy emergency and various other declarations he's made since taking office in January, Trump now oversees 11 active national emergencies simultaneously. That's the most ever by a single president at one time in American history. He's using emergency powers, not for actual emergencies that require urgent response, but as a routine everyday way to bypass the normal legislative process and implement policies that Congress hasn't authorized, and in many cases has explicitly rejected. He's turned emergency declarations from rare responses to genuine crises requiring immediate action into a standard governing tool for implementing his political agenda without any democratic accountability whatsoever. All right, let's really dig into what this energy emergency declaration means and why it's generating such intense controversy across the political spectrum. Because this isn't just about whether you personally support fossil fuels or renewable energy, although that policy debate is obviously part of what's happening here. This is about fundamental questions of constitutional structure and executive power that go to the very heart of how American democracy is supposed to function and whether we still have a government of laws rather than a government of one man's will. So let me walk you through the legal framework, what the executive order actually does in practice, and why so many people from across the ideological spectrum are genuinely alarmed by what Trump has claimed the authority to do. First, let's understand the National Emergencies Act and how it's supposed to work in our constitutional system. This law was passed by Congress in 1976, specifically to create some structure and meaningful limits around presidential emergency powers that had grown unchecked over the preceding decades. Before that law was enacted, presidents had accumulated dozens of emergency declarations over many years without any real oversight mechanism or expiration process. Some emergencies declared during World War II were technically still in effect decades later because no one had ever formally terminated them. The National Emergencies Act was supposed to fix that problem by requiring presidents to specify which statutory authorities they're invoking when they declare an emergency, and by giving Congress the explicit ability to terminate emergencies through a joint resolution if members believe the emergency is no longer justified. The fundamental idea behind the law was to preserve executive flexibility for genuine emergencies that require rapid response while simultaneously creating accountability and meaningful limits on how long those emergency powers could last. But here's the problem that has become increasingly apparent over the years. The law has never really worked the way its authors intended it to function. Congress has very rarely used its termination authority to end emergency declarations even when they've dragged on for years or decades. Courts have been extremely reluctant to second-guess presidential determinations of what constitutes an emergency that justifies invoking these powers. And over time, presidents of both political parties have stretched the concept of what qualifies as an emergency further and further from its original meaning. What was supposed to be reserved for genuine crises requiring immediate response has gradually expanded to cover all sorts of policy disputes and political priorities. Trump has taken that stretching of emergency powers to an entirely new and unprecedented level with the energy declaration he signed on his first day. The executive order claims that insufficient energy production in certain regions of the country constitutes a threat to national security and the economy that fully justifies invoking emergency powers normally reserved for wars and natural disasters. But let's look very carefully at the actual facts on the ground in American energy production. The United States is currently producing more oil and natural gas than at any point in its entire history. We've become a net energy exporter for the first time in many decades. We're actually selling energy to other countries rather than depending on imports from foreign sources. There is no actual shortage of energy production anywhere in the country. There may certainly be legitimate debates about distribution systems and infrastructure needs and the proper mix of energy sources, but the fundamental idea that we're facing an energy emergency requiring extraordinary presidential powers is simply not supported by any objective evidence. What Trump is really doing is using emergency language and emergency powers to override policies he personally disagrees with, particularly state-level green energy mandates and federal environmental regulations that his administration finds inconvenient for his political goals. The scope of what the executive order actually authorizes federal agencies to do is genuinely breathtaking when you take the time to read through the actual text of the order and the accompanying implementation directives. It orders the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency to identify and immediately suspend regulations that the administration believes are hindering energy production, even though these are regulations that went through proper notice and comment rulemaking over many years with extensive public participation. These are regulations that federal courts have reviewed and upheld as legally valid. These are regulations that Congress has implicitly approved through funding decisions and oversight activities. And Trump is claiming he can simply wave his hand and suspend all of them because he's declared an emergency. That's not how the regulatory process is supposed to work under American law. That's not how the separation of powers established by the Constitution is supposed to work. But that's exactly what's happening right now. The executive order also redirects massive amounts of federal funding, more than $10 billion, according to detailed analyses by legal experts, toward fossil fuel infrastructure projects favored by the administration. This money was appropriated by Congress for specific purposes through the normal budget process that the Constitution establishes. The Constitution is extremely clear that Congress controls the power of the purse, that the executive branch can only spend money that Congress has appropriated and only for the purposes that Congress specified when it appropriated those funds. But Trump is claiming that emergency powers allow him to redirect funds regardless of what Congress intended when it passed the relevant appropriations bills. This is very similar to what he attempted during his first term with border wall funding, when he declared an emergency to redirect military construction funds after Congress explicitly refused to appropriate the money he wanted for the wall. Courts eventually allowed some of that redirection to proceed, which emboldened Trump to attempt even more aggressive fund transfers in his second term, now that he's back in power. Perhaps most alarming of all the provisions in the executive order is the directive to deploy military logistics capabilities to support civilian energy infrastructure projects. The order authorizes using military transportation assets, military engineering capabilities, military personnel and equipment to build pipelines and support drilling operations on American soil. This blurs the traditional line between civilian and military functions in ways that raise very serious concerns about the proper role of the armed forces in domestic policy. The military is supposed to defend the country against foreign threats and enemies, not serve as a construction force for the president's preferred domestic policy projects. Using military resources for civilian policy purposes, especially highly controversial and politically charged purposes like fossil fuel development, sets a dangerous precedent that could be exploited in all kinds of troubling ways by future presidents of either party. Now let's talk about how this energy emergency connects to the broader pattern of Trump's aggressive use of emergency powers throughout his second term. The energy declaration absolutely did not happen in isolation. It was part of a coordinated strategy from day one. On the exact same day, January 20th, 2025, Trump also declared a national emergency at the southern border based on his claim that there's an invasion happening that justifies extraordinary measures, including potentially deploying military force domestically against migrants and asylum seekers. Between these two major declarations and various other emergencies he's declared since taking office, Trump now has 11 active national emergencies simultaneously under his direct control. That's completely unprecedented in American history. No previous president has had anywhere close to that many simultaneous emergency declarations in effect at the same time. And each of those declarations comes with statutory authorities that give the president expanded powers that Congress never intended to be used routinely for ordinary policy disputes, but only in genuine crises requiring immediate response. All right, let's break this down into the key points everyone needs to understand about Trump's energy emergency declaration and why it matters so much for the future of American democracy and constitutional government. Because this isn't just about energy policy or environmental regulations, although those are certainly important issues that affect all of us. This is about whether there are any meaningful limits on presidential power in our system and what happens to our democracy when a president is willing to claim emergency authority for situations that aren't actually emergencies by any reasonable definition. Point number one, Trump is using emergency declarations as a routine governing tool rather than as a response to genuine crises, and that fundamentally changes how our entire constitutional system is supposed to work. The whole point of emergency powers is that they're supposed to be temporary and strictly limited responses to extraordinary situations. Wars that threaten the nation's survival, natural disasters that overwhelm normal response capabilities, attacks on the country that require immediate military action. Emergency powers exist because sometimes the normal deliberative legislative process is simply too slow to respond to genuinely urgent threats that require immediate action. But Trump isn't using emergency powers that way at all. He's using emergency declarations to bypass Congress on routine policy disputes where there's no actual emergency requiring urgent response. He disagrees with environmental regulations, so he declares an energy emergency to suspend them unilaterally. He wants more border enforcement funding than Congress is willing to appropriate, so he declares a border emergency to redirect money without congressional approval. This transforms emergency powers from a narrow safety valve for genuine crises into a permanent alternative to the constitutional legislative process. If this becomes normalized and accepted, if presidents can just declare emergencies whenever Congress won't give them exactly what they want, then the constitutional separation of powers becomes essentially meaningless. Point number 2, the specific factual claims underlying the Energy Emergency Declaration are simply not supported by objective evidence, which strongly suggests this is a pretext for desired policy changes rather than a genuine response to an actual crisis situation. The United States is currently producing more energy than ever before in its entire history as a nation. We're exporting oil and natural gas in record quantities to countries around the world. There are no widespread blackouts caused by insufficient production, and to the extent there are grid reliability issues in some regions, those are related to infrastructure and distribution systems rather than overall production levels. Trump's executive order claims there's insufficient energy production, threatening national security, but that claim simply does not match the objective reality of American energy production today. When the factual basis for an emergency declaration is demonstrably false, when the claimed emergency doesn't actually exist in the real world, that's extremely strong evidence that the emergency is being manufactured to justify a power grab rather than declared in genuine response to actual circumstances requiring urgent action. Point number 3, the energy emergency connects directly to and reinforces all the other instances of executive overreach we've been documenting throughout Trump's second term on this channel. The deportation flights that continued defiantly after federal courts ordered them to stop. The DOJ being systematically weaponized against political enemies with revenge prosecutions. The FBI being aggressively purged of independent voices who might question orders. The military lawyers being sidelined and fired for providing honest legal advice. In every single case, the pattern is identical. Trump and his appointed officials believe they can do whatever they want regardless of legal limits, and they're clearly willing to defy courts and ignore constitutional constraints whenever those constraints interfere with achieving their goals. The energy emergency is absolutely part of this broader pattern of lawlessness. It's another example of an administration that views legal limits as obstacles to be overcome through creative interpretation rather than boundaries to be respected. And the cumulative effect of all these instances taken together is an executive branch that increasingly operates outside the rule of law. Point number 4, the political and economic risks of this aggressive approach are genuinely significant and could backfire very badly on Republicans heading into the 2026 midterm elections. If the aggressive deregulation and fund redirection leads to environmental disasters or infrastructure failures that harm communities, the administration will completely own those consequences and face voter backlash. If the emergency powers are ultimately struck down by courts and projects have to be halted midstream after billions have been spent, that creates chaos and waste that voters will absolutely notice and remember. If energy prices spike because of policy disruptions rather than falling as Trump repeatedly promised during his campaign, that completely undermines the core economic argument for his approach. And beyond the specific policy outcomes, there's a broader political risk in being perceived as governing through emergency decrees rather than democratic processes. Americans generally don't like presidents who act like they're above the law, even when they happen to agree with the specific policies being implemented through those methods. Now, what happens next with the energy emergency and the numerous legal challenges working through the courts? In the short term, expect the lawsuits to continue working their way through the federal court system while the administration moves forward aggressively with implementation. The legal process takes many months or even years to reach final resolution, and the administration clearly knows that speed creates significant advantages for their position. Every day that passes with the emergency declaration in effect is a day that permits get issued and projects move forward and facts get created on the ground that become harder to reverse. The deliberate strategy is to make any future reversal as difficult and costly as possible, even if courts eventually rule that the declaration was illegal from the start. In the medium term, watch carefully for specific instances where the emergency powers are used in ways that generate controversy and significant public pushback. Environmental groups will highlight projects that are approved without proper environmental review. State attorneys general will challenge federal override of their state's energy policies. Scientists and independent experts will document environmental harms resulting from suspended regulations. Each of these instances will generate news coverage and intensify political debate, and the administration will have to defend its actions in the court of public opinion as well as in actual courtrooms. In the long term, this is really about whether emergency powers become a normalized and accepted part of how presidents routinely govern, or whether some meaningful limits eventually get reestablished through court rulings or congressional action. If Trump successfully uses emergency declarations to bypass Congress on major policy issues without facing real consequences, future presidents of both parties will inevitably be tempted to do exactly the same thing. The precedent being set here extends far beyond energy policy or environmental regulation. It's about whether the executive branch can simply claim emergency authority whenever the legislative branch doesn't cooperate with what the president wants, effectively making Congress irrelevant for any issue a president cares enough about to declare an emergency. That's a fundamental transformation of American government that goes far beyond any partisan debate about energy or the environment. And here's the crucial connection to everything else happening with this administration right now. The energy emergency is part of the exact same governing philosophy that produced the DOJ chaos and the deportation flight, defiance, and the attacks on military lawyers and all the other controversies we've been documenting on this channel. It's a philosophy that says the president's will is supreme and should not be constrained, that legal limits are mere suggestions rather than real constraints, that courts can be defied and Congress can be bypassed and institutions can be dismantled if they get in the way of what the president wants to accomplish. Whether you personally agree with Trump's energy policies or not, whether you think environmental regulations have gone too far or not far enough, the method being used matters enormously. How we govern matters, and governing through manufactured emergencies and unilateral executive decrees is simply not how American democracy is supposed to work under our Constitution. The founders designed our system with checks and balances, specifically because they feared concentrated executive power based on their direct experience living under monarchical rule. They had lived under a king who could do whatever he wanted without any accountability, and they created a constitution specifically designed to prevent that from ever happening in America. Emergency powers exist as a narrow and limited exception to normal constitutional constraints, not as a routine alternative to democratic governance. What Trump is doing with the energy emergency and with his many other emergency declarations threatens to swallow the constitutional rule entirely and make unilateral executive decree the new normal for American government. And once that transformation happens, once emergency powers become just another routine policy tool available to any president, it will be extraordinarily difficult to put that genie back in a bottle regardless of which party controls the White House in the future. All right, that's going to do it for this one. This is a story with enormous implications for American democracy and for how we're governed going forward for decades to come. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think about this situation. Is Trump right to use emergency powers aggressively to implement his agenda when Congress won't cooperate? Or is this exactly the kind of executive overreach that threatens constitutional government? Should Congress do more to rein in emergency declarations? I genuinely want to hear your perspective on these important questions. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell because there's so much happening right now. The energy emergency is just one piece of the chaos engulfing the country, and you need to stay informed about all of it. Until then, keep paying attention, keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you in the next one.